This is Testing Without Limits, Agentforce Testing at Scale. If that's not what you expected, then you may be in the wrong theater. But we'll go ahead and continue on. Would love your feedback in the Salesforce app. As always, you can leave your feedback on the Salesforce Events app for the talk. Any feedback is welcome. And thank you all so much for attending the session. And it's always nice to have a live audience. So, first and foremost, my name is Michael Dailey. I am PBU Director at Provar, which essentially means I'm a product manager for one of our Salesforce apps that we have on the App Exchange, Provar Manager. So I'll be talking about that a little bit, but the primary focus of today is going to be on testing and Agentforce. So we'll start today by talking through the kind of the evolving landscape. As everyone knows, everything is always in a state of change and flux with Agentforce. So we'll talk through kind of where we are today with that. We'll talk through Agentforce testing and the different types of testing that exist and how they apply to Agentforce specifically, why we test, and in parentheses there, especially Agentforce, the different developer tooling that exists on the platform today, both provided by Salesforce and also partner tooling, and kind of the current state of things. Even as of this week, I had to update my slides because the current state is always changing. So just something to be aware of. This is as of today. And we'll talk a little bit about the Agentforce adoption gaps that exist and how we can help bridge those gaps with some of the partner tooling, but also through Salesforce provided testing tooling and different things like that. And then as always, I like to do demos, so we'll do a demo at the end. And if you have any questions, those are always welcome. So first and foremost, who is Provar? If you've never heard of us, this is kind of a 30,000-foot view of who we are as a company. Our main MO, if you will, we started the company 11 years ago to test Salesforce. Obviously, testing Salesforce is a very big thing because you're not just usually talking about Salesforce itself, talking about all the different clouds, Agentforce, all the different end systems, everything like that. So we've evolved over the years to be able to expand our capabilities to handle all those different scenarios. And this is kind of the problem statement that we're starting with today. As Salesforce grows more complex and Agentforce introduces intelligent, unpredictable behavior, non-deterministic behavior, traditional testing methods can no longer keep pace. So that's kind of the question that we're going to be tackling today as our main problem. So I'll talk through the different types of testing and the testing landscape as it applies to Agentforce. So unit testing, obviously from a developer perspective, we can test our agent actions in through Apex. You have Apex actions that can be added as actions to your agents through invocable methods. Those can all be tested through traditional means, and code coverage and all of that apply. So that's kind of the first thing that you would typically do if you're doing Apex actions that are configured to work with Agentforce. Then maybe a step above that, you have integration testing, which again, you can do some of this with Apex with proper mocking. If you have integrations for Agentforce, you can test those as well. Good data setup is always necessary and relevant. And then permissions and different field permission tests are always going to be relevant for Agentforce specifically. So we'll get into that a little bit more later. Functional testing, when we talk about Apex actions, that's only one type of agent action that you can include in your agent. You can also do flows. So being able to test those flows and those full conversations is going to be incredibly important. And then regression testing, which is kind of where we focus a lot of our time from the Provar perspective. Regression testing is more about testing impact of changes. So if you change an Apex action or an agent action, you change a topic, you add an instruction, take away an instruction, how does that affect our agent and how do we test for that? So that's kind of one of the things we'll be talking a little bit more about. And validating data and all the things that the agent is actually supposed to be doing. So you can validate the outcome of the response, but being able to validate what the agent performs is another thing there. And then the last bit of this is security and compliance. So obviously we want to be able to handle different authentication methods. We want the agent to have proper handling of our data for PII and healthcare and different things like that. And we want to also make sure that it's defensible and has good guardrails in place for prompt injection and different things like that. So why test? Hopefully this question is a bit of a rhetorical one. When we're talking about Agentforce, we've seen a lot of sessions this week, a lot of talk about developing on the platform and all the different tooling, but really the main goal is reducing business risk. But there's another side of this, and that's around enhancing customer experience. So it's not just making sure the app doesn't have bugs, but also making sure that the customers have a good experience with whatever we're trying to achieve with our products. And cost savings is a big one. So this concept of TITO, which I ran out of room on the row here, so I created an acronym. I don't know if this was one before or not, but test early, test often. It's a similar concept from the DevOps perspective, where you want to test as early as you can in the developer lifecycle. And we talk about accelerating development cycles. So the goal is to move fast and not break things, not introduce bugs, as we call them, regressions, into your environments as you go along. And then the last bit of this is being able to leverage any insights that we have to create smarter test planning, better coverage, and execution for all of our agent tests and our unit tests and different things like that. So we'll be talking a little bit more, shifting along here. I'm going to keep things moving. We'll talk a little bit about the Agentforce developer tooling. And then I put at the top here, as of October 2025, because as I mentioned, this is in a constant state of change. So this is kind of the state where we are now. We have, from the development perspective, you have Agentforce Builder. This is one of the slides I had to update this week because it was previously known as Agent Builder. So hopefully I'm up to date there. But Agentforce Builder, obviously, this is where you build and you're doing your basic smoke testing for your agents. You have Code Analyzer, which is going to analyze static code analysis for all your Apex code. Apex Guru, which is injected with AI to allow you to do better performance for your Apex and different things like that. And then we have other developer tooling that's all being thrown into the platform to assist you with your developer experience. So I won't go into all of them. The majority of our focus today is going to be on testing. So I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these in more detail, but just kind of throwing these up there to have a list. And then for the last piece of this, ALM, project management, application lifecycle management is very important. So you have DevOps Center, DevOps testing, integrated experience, and the developer part of it for Salesforce. These are part of the platform. So we definitely want to be able to incorporate our whatever we're doing with Agentforce into those processes as well. And of course, they come with the capabilities to do things like Salesforce Code Analyzer runs. You can run your Agentforce Testing Center test through DevOps testing, and you can also run flow testing and unit testing as of winter 26. So this is a process overview for how you might test your agents. So you can think about this as kind of a progression as you go along. The early stages, and this is what you usually see demonstrated when you're going to a session and they're talking about agents, they'll show you Agentforce Builder and they'll show you how you can interact with an agent through a prompt there. Typically what's demonstrated is a happy path, right? They don't want it to fail, they want it to do the thing that they expect it's going to do, so they're just going to show you kind of a happy path scenario there. But the next stage of that, right, is you want to do more testing. You want to make sure you have the unit testing in place for all of your invocable Apex actions that the agent is consuming, and flow testing for any flows that it may be consuming as well. So as you're kind of progressing along here, we have the scalable testing aspect. So we'll talk a little bit more about Agentforce Testing Center. This is a very hot topic for us, especially because we're trying to kind of explain, what are the difference between Testing Center, flow testing, Apex testing, Provar. There's all these different ways that you can test, especially with Agentforce. So I'll get a little bit more into that. But you can think about it as scalable unit testing for single turn validations for your agent. Essentially what that means is single turn validation is a one prompt, one response test. So it's very unit focused. And then as you go along here, again, user testing or persona-based testing, this is usually where you're testing actually agents that have been deployed to an experience site, WhatsApp, a different channel, something like that, right? So you actually need those to be in a deployable messaging channel before they can be tested. And then end-to-end testing is kind of the highest level here, the echelon. This is where the last stage of the process typically where you want to make sure that everything's working end-to-end. And this is also a difficult thing to achieve with Agentforce because we have to make sure that all of our integrations that we want in the production environment are being replicated in the lower level environments as well, and that we're properly testing them and making sure that the data is consistent. So let's talk a little bit about manual testing, because most people that we conversate with, even still in the early days, this was also a problem with the different events that we would go to. We'd talk to people, how are you doing your testing? Oh, we're doing everything manually, which was surprising for us. But even in today, we find a lot of people are still doing a lot of manual testing. And usually that's because of a number of different reasons. Budget could be because of resources, could be because they don't know what tools they should be using. They don't know what capabilities they need. So these are kind of some of the things that usually go into it. So I'll talk through a little bit about that. So for Agentforce Builder, right, you have two kinds of situations where you're dealing with pre-activation manual scenarios. In other words, you haven't activated the agent yet. You're just testing it in Agentforce Builder, making sure that it works for a couple of smoke testing scenarios. But then once you activate it, you may be doing some manual testing as here as well, if you want to do some internal testing on that. Now you get conversation preview, you get the event logs, you get all that information inside of Agentforce Builder. So you do have that going for Agentforce Builder. And then the second one here is for deployed agent chats. I mentioned this a little bit briefly, but this is essentially testing your agent where it lives. So this is actually really close to a real world scenario. So it's something that is very valuable, but again, it's not necessarily scalable. So we're talking about scalable testing here. And then flows and validations is the last kind of piece of manual testing here. This is where you would be testing your actual flows that the agent is consuming, making sure that all those work outside of the agent, but also when they're referenced by it as well. So these are some things that we have to keep in mind. So what are the advantages, the pros and cons of these different approaches? So on the pros, these tools are very user-friendly. They have an interface. They're readily available to everyone. Everyone is kind of familiar with them by now, for the most part, and how to use them. So they have a very small learning curve, right? And then like I said, they typically represent real-world use cases for the most part, because you're actually interacting with the agent like a user would. You're typing in there, you're waiting for a response, and you're kind of coming up with what to say next. The cons are this can be time-consuming. Just doing it one time, just for one scenario, that's not really something to be concerned about. But if you think about all the different variations, especially if you have an agent deployed and you have 1,000 or more customers interacting with it, they're all going to go about that conversation very differently. So how do you test for all those permutations? That's the challenge. And the second piece here is that you have to actually wait for a deployable agent if you're testing it inside of a chat. You can't actually test it before you've put it live, in other words. So this is a downside to this approach. So it's a bit more reactive. And as I mentioned, it's impossible to cover all the permutations. You have tester bias in play. In other words, I as a tester may use a specific account, a specific way of wording things, and someone else could do it a very different way, and that could impact how the agent responds. So these are all negatives in terms of how we can manually test Agentforce, and really what we're trying to highlight here is the gaps that exist in the existing interfaces and how you're going to roll these agents out. The last one here is the repetition. So when you're talking about testing and DevOps, you're trying to replicate as close as you can your earlier sandboxes to production as close as you possibly can, right? That's the idea. But as you go along there, you're having to retest everything that you've already tested as you promote changes from one environment to the next. So it can be very repetitive. It can be very time-consuming. So as I mentioned, kind of the next stage, we have unit and basic functional testing. So theoretically, when we're thinking about Apex testing, we can validate all of our agent actions. We can have our agent using 100% Apex if we want. This can all be validated programmatically. So theoretically, your agent should be very deterministic, right? We have these deterministic actions and outcomes that we've injected into it. Now we have flow testing as well. So flow testing is new as of winter 26, and this can be triggered as part of DevOps testing additionally to Apex testing. And you can debug these flows, right? When you get a flow error in your email, you can go and debug it. You can save it as a test, and you can run those things, and you can also run them as part of your pipeline. And you can also check for different fault paths and permissions for the flows. So all that is available to you. So there's different levels of debugging for these that are available out of the box. So again, kind of going through the pros and cons here. They can both be triggered in DevOps Center pipelines, so they can run in CI/CD. So that's a big thing, right? Being able to queue these off programmatically as part of a process, so we know we have those quality gates in place. You can also directly validate your agent's logic under the hood. So as I mentioned, deterministic outcomes are testable. We can test an Apex method. So theoretically, if the agent is using that method, if it's been tested with Apex, it should work exactly as we expect it to. And as I mentioned, there's numerous different debugging options. These all work with Agentforce vibes, so you can create unit tests and flow tests with Agentforce vibes for Agentforce already available. So all these things are really, really good. And we can also test inactive agents via the API and the CLI. So we don't have to wait for a deployable agent in these use cases. Now the negatives on this is, the biggest thing here that we've noticed is that agents consume these actions non-deterministically. Now behind the scenes, under the hood, if you will, for Agentforce is the Atlas reasoning engine, which determines how an agent gets routed to a topic, an action, and ultimately how it actually consumes that action. You can't necessarily control that. You can try to fine-tune it as closely as you can, right? By adding additional instructions, adding required parameters, optional parameters, and making sure that they're within certain boundaries. But at the end of the day, it's an agent, it's an LLM. There are things that are going to be non-deterministic about it. And so that leads to scalability issues because you can't test for every eventuality. Even if you have 100% Apex code coverage for your agent actions, because they're non-deterministic, you can't always test for scale here. And as I mentioned, we're talking about more unit testing, so that's less of an admin thing in this case. So this experience specifically is less admin friendly once you get into Apex actions that have been invoked through agents. And you're not really testing to end-to-end functionality as well. If you talk about an Apex method and you talk about flow testing, you're really just testing that one thing. It's very unit-based. It's not necessarily taking into context the full end-to-end scenario of how it might be utilized. So that's another thing to keep in mind here. So that kind of introduces Testing Center. So this is meant to solve some of the previous challenges when I talked about manual, unit, and functional testing for Apex, for Agentforce Builder, and for flow testing. So the advantages there, when we talk about Testing Center, so let me go ahead and click through here. It is unit/integration level testing, depending on how you look about it. Excuse me. But I'm going to call them basically agent tests for the remainder of the session, just to kind of shorten that. So agent tests, they're very similar to unit tests. They're very capable of injecting a conversation history so they can take into context and simulate a multi-turn validation. So you can kind of have an idea of how a user might interact with an agent there. You can run these tests in Scratch orgs. You can run them in sandboxes. They are enabled there. And they're fully parallelized. Get that out there. So they can be run at scale. You can run 100 of these in parallel across your environment. And the other thing here is that they can be AI generated. So Testing Center does have the capability to generate test cases in the UI using AI. So you can create 100 different scenarios, and they should be semi-random. You would think they would be taking into context your org and all the data in there. Doesn't always happen exactly the way that you think it would, which I'll show an example of that in a moment. And they are CLI ready, meaning they can be invoked through the DevOps testing. They can be invoked from the command line. They can be invoked from a developer tooling like VS Code and different things like that. So those are all kind of the advantages of Testing Center. The drawbacks here, and I don't want to call them disadvantages, because we're really just trying to kind of tell you, here's our experience with it. We have our own agents that we've tested with some of these different toolings, and here's what we found, right? So when we talk about the drawbacks, I put asterisks here because all this is as of today. There's no historical reporting. So when you run an Agentforce Testing Center test or an agent test, the last result basically overrides the previous one. So what you see is always the latest result. You don't see an actual historical report or data of the tests over time, which for me is a big gap. As a tester or someone who's wanting to look at dashboards and reports of testing over a period of time, not having historical reporting is a big miss here. So I'm assuming that's going to be filled at some point, just in the current state and the way that it is, that's where we are. And single-turn validations is another big one. Anyone who's ever used ChatGPT or any Copilot or any AI tool or LLM, you typically don't go through a process of a single prompt, a single response, and then you go and do something else. Usually it's a conversation. There's 4 or 5 turns, maybe even more. So you need to be able to validate the entire conversation, not just a single utterance, not just a single prompt. That's a big gap here as far as how this actually represents how a user would use your agent. And as I mentioned, there's no data validations here. This is another big one. When we think about agent tests, the way that they're run and the outcomes that they're validating, they're not actually validating whether the agent performed those actions in your org. For example, if it's supposed to retrieve data and update a record, send a case closure email, etc., it may say that it has done that action, but how do you know that it's actually been done in the org? Agentforce Testing Center doesn't actually validate that. It only validates the response itself. So this is kind of a gap here when we talk about data validations. And in some cases, I should have an asterisk here as well. For long run times, this kind of depends. Your mileage may vary. For my situation, we were testing it. We ran about 20 tests for up to Agentforce Testing Center. Took about 6 minutes. So when thinking about scalability here, if I were to multiply this by 5, then we can end up being like 30 minutes per batch. So depending on your number of agents and topics, these runtimes can be somewhat a little bit longer than expected. If you're thinking about the unit testing world where things run in a matter of seconds and minutes, as opposed to 30 minutes and sometimes even longer than that. So just something to keep in mind there. And another one here, again, coming from a developer and a tester perspective, I don't like cluttered orgs with tons of data from testers that just leave all these records behind. So all the DML statements that are performed by the agents, If you ask it to create a record as part of your agent test, it's actually going to create that record, but it's not going to revert it. So it's just going to be there forever, unless you go and clean up periodically after your agent. So this is another thing. It's a bit of a tedious process, something you may not know out of the gate if you start using Agentforce Testing Center, being able to keep track of all the data that it's creating and modifying. And another one here, no user testing. This is really just being able to emulate personas. It's a big important thing from the testing perspective. You want to be able to test as the end user. Testing Center doesn't really do that. And the last bit here is test consume credits. So in Sandbox, they consume less credits than they do in production. However, when you're testing hundreds of different tests in Agentforce Testing Center, this can add up over time. We haven't really tested this and see how many credits this is actually using behind the scenes, but it's going to cost money to ultimately test your agents. So we'll get a little bit more into Testing Center specs. So I'm going to dive deep onto what this all looks like. So this is what they call a Testing Center spec. In other words, it's just a definition file for an agent test. So it's XML, so I can use this here and kind of point around. So what we have at the top here, this is the actual utterance that's being tested. Then we have the expected topic, we have expected actions, and we have expected outcomes. Those are the three main things that you're typically validating when you're doing a Testing Center test. So you can also build in a conversation history. So if you notice this bit here, this is actually a prefabbed conversation that I created. It's not actually happening in the agent. This is just something that I have to give the agent context for the actual outcome that I'm trying to test. Now, the difference in how this behaves and how it might behave in real time is that in this Testing Center spec, what I've done is I've basically asked the agent to create a test plan schedule for me for a certain time, and then I asked it to update that schedule to change it to a different time. What happens in Testing Center is it doesn't actually create the record until this bit here. Nothing happens down here, really. This is all fake. So the actual utterance is what fires off the creation. So the record gets created with the change time. The reason I'm pointing that out, if you look at the adverse, if I go through the same conversation with how someone might actually use an agent or an Agentforce builder, if I ask the agent to create a record with a given time, etc., it's just going to create it. And then if I ask it to update it, it's going to update it. So two things happen. Rather, on the Testing Center side, the only thing that really happened was the initial creation. So you notice there's actually a difference in how, when you're running things in Testing Center versus how they play out in real time, can be a very different experience. You're not really testing what the agent is really doing. So this, to me, is kind of a difference of behavior that's pretty important from a tester, because you don't necessarily guarantee that this is going to work the same way as this. Now, taking a little bit deeper look at Testing Center results. So this is an example when you're creating an agent test. This is the interface here at the top. And as I mentioned, we have these three main categories. We have topic, hopefully that's not too small, but basically we have topic, we have action, and we have outcome. Those are the three main things that we're testing. Now, Agentforce Testing Center also has response quality evaluations, which are basically just these different criteria that you can also validate. These are a little bit more subjective, so they're not exactly gray, black and white when it comes to evaluating your agents. And these default evaluations, however, are the biggest things that you're going to be looking at. So we talk about these default evaluations. This is an example here of what it actually looks like when we generate an Agentforce Testing Center test. So we have basically a prompt over here. We have whether or not the topic passed, whether or not the action passed, the outcome, and then any response quality evaluations as well. So we get kind of a layout of how all the tests have run, and it kind of can be exported to a CSV or a spreadsheet. So you kind of get the idea of what the test results look like there. Now, looking at failures a little bit deeper. So apologies for the text here if it's too small to read, but the idea here is that we have two main examples of a test failure. So, and this is for our agent that we've actually been building internally. So for the first one, we have a topic pass. So that's here at the top. We have an action failure and we have an outcome failure. So if we look at those, it looks like initially we may need to tweak our instructions for our agent, as the action that was performed was not what we expected, and it constitutes a failure or a bug. So this also resulted in additional actions that were taken that we didn't actually expect in our initial test that we created. Now, if we look at the second example, This is a red herring or a false positive. So this one, basically what happened is we have a validation for an outcome and it fails. The topic and the action pass, but the outcome fails. But if you can read the text there, if you based on the intent that we've defined, it should have passed. The agent performed the task, we put an intent in there, and it should have passed in this example. So what usually ends up happening is you deal with a lot of these false positives in Testing Center, where you basically need to go back and say, okay, this isn't a bug, I just need to rework my test a little bit, tweak my testing spec. I don't actually want to update my instructions because the agent did its job. So that's just one thing to keep in mind whenever you're creating these tests here. So how do we investigate these different results? Like I said, there's 3 different layers that you're looking at, and that's the topic, the action, and the outcome alignment. And then the question that you have to ask is this a false positive? In other words, if it was a false positive, meaning the test failed but it shouldn't have, then we just need to tweak the test spec. We don't actually need to modify our agent. This happens quite often in testing. And then if it's not a false positive, it actually did alert us to a bug, then we need to tweak our instructions or our actions or something like that. So these are kind of the 2 main ways that you handle these failures. So you can obviously test these a little bit deeper in Agentforce Builder if you want to go there and kind of debug things. Again, you can verify the alignment of the topic and the action. You can also look at the debug logs, the event logs, and get all that information. Here are some of the common issues that I faced when I was dealing with this in testing our agent. So a lot of times, this is kind of the main thing that I ended up doing, was having to refine my instructions for topic alignment. So that's usually the first thing you try to get right. Make sure the agent can actually route the question to the correct topic. That's the first step. The next step is making sure that it can route to the correct action. And then the last step is making sure that it validates that outcome. Another common issue that I faced was permissions. Because agents have their own defined permission, you can create a custom permission set for them. You need to make sure that that permission set includes any records that the agent needs to access. Otherwise, you'll deal with kind of ambiguous errors that you're not really sure because the agent, because there's guardrails there, it tries not to alert the user that I can't access a specific record because that could be a security loophole. So there are some things that you're not necessarily sure why it would fail. Permissions are another step that I usually go to. And the last bit here is incorrect or invalid test data. So for example, when I created an Agentforce test in Testing Center using the AI generation, a lot of times it would use invalid records that didn't exist in the org, or it would just use invalid pick list values or fields that didn't exist for custom objects. So you have to kind of go and look at those tests and actually what they're generating to see if they're relevant for your org. So all this, we talked about development testing, and the ALM is kind of the last piece of this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about DevOps testing before I get into Provar. DevOps testing, for those of you that don't know what it is, this is the Salesforce integrated solution for DevOps Center. It's what allows you to basically queue off all of your tests from promotions to different sandboxes in your environments. But you can also add what's called a quality gate. A quality gate is basically just an automated check to ensure that this set of tests pass before it promotes further downstream. The benefit here is that it's Agentforce testing ready. As you can see in this bit here at the top, we can add Testing Center tests to our quality gates. We can also add Provar to our quality gates. And the 2 that aren't mentioned here, which are new, are flow tests and Apex tests as well. But basically this, I'll go into this a little bit more detail, but you can see the quality gates and how they're defined here, the tests and how they're defined and how they're imported. And then lastly, at the top there is kind of how we assign those quality gates as well. Okay, so the bottom line here, we had the problem statement. This is kind of the challenge, and this is where we kind of fit this gap, right? So agents need testing, tooling needs a gap, Provar fills a lot of that gap. So the underlying question to all this is, how are you testing your agents? So we talked about all the different methods and the tools and the different gaps and the pros and cons, right? So agents interact with all these different things. They interact with enterprise apps outside of Salesforce. They interact with emails, databases, APIs, Salesforce clouds, you name it, right? So we need to be able to test all those things, which we already have capabilities to do, but we also need to be able to test Agentforce itself. So along the bottom here, those are kind of some of the things that we have to be able to test Agentforce specifically. So being able to test across different systems and orgs, being able to test across different personas to make sure that we're actually doing proper user testing, and multi-turn validations is probably one of the biggest ones that I've pointed out as far as how Testing Center differs from Provar, is being able to validate each turn in a conversation. And the last two here are recent additions that we've added into the product to be able to generate a various list of utterances, which are basically just randomized prompts for testing. So that's one thing, very similar to what Testing Center does. But then we also have this intent validation, which allows us to validate the agent's intent based on the action that's being performed. And then the last bit of this that's not specifically mentioned as a bottom element is the data validation. So we want to make sure that the agent response is correct and accurate. We also want to make sure that whatever data it's modifying or creating or what have you is actually being performed in the org, which we can do inside of Provar as well. So this is, I want to take a step back a little bit from Agentforce and just kind of zoom out on this picture. So this is the testing iceberg, as I like to call it. And at the very top here is the UI. Most tools kind of live in this area where they're testing the UI itself. UI automation is notoriously brittle within the realm of Salesforce because what lies beneath the surface are all these different complexities that we need to account for. And now Agentforce being thrown into the mix is another thing that we need to consider. So being Salesforce aware is kind of a key that has made Provar the leader in Salesforce test automation for 11 years, is because we have different capabilities and feature sets to be able to test and integrate with all these different things here. So how do we do that? We provide powerful, intuitive end-to-end test automation at scale. And really what that translates to is being able to test the same thing across all of your orgs, all of your environments in the same manner, being able to test all of your different personas, being able to modularize your testing so you can scale it out across your teams more effectively. So I'm going to take a brief moment here before I jump into the demo, because I will want to spend some time there. But this diagram, the assumption being made here pulled into this is that you have your build and design stages where all of your requirements may be generated. But this is kind of a quality lifecycle management view as we would have it with Provar. So very similar to kind of the DevOps infinity loop, but we've kind of unraveled it and put different swim lanes for different personas that are going to be interacting. The idea here, the central concept, is that this release manager is coordinating with the admins, the developers, and the QAs from the early stages. So when developers are building out their code, their functionality, they're writing new features and Apex tests for those features, right alongside them, ideally, is the admin doing the configuration work, the QA designing manual test cases to be able to account for those changes. While they can't build automated tests on features that don't exist, they can obviously design the manual tests if they know what the user requirements are beforehand. So then you kind of get to the next stages where you want to push your changes into a central repository, a central environment, and that's where you would begin automation. Test automation comes into play. We trigger our pipeline to push further downstream, and then you have these quality gates that are being implemented. So this is kind of an ideal picture. It doesn't always work this way, and this isn't necessarily the one right way to do things. It's just an example of how it might play out if you have a very interactive and aligned team. So we have these quality gates, right? So we can use them to report any issues or coverage gaps. If quality gates fail, that loops back around to developers and QAs to refine their tests or make changes to their code or their config, right? So we have this feedback loop happening. But we also have this higher confidence approval rate. So when you're actually, your release managers, your DevOps, your architects, they're promoting further downstream, they can look at these quality gates and say, okay, we've tested all these features, we have all these things that are properly being covered, so we can now release with more confidence that we know it's not going to break everything. So that's kind of the idea there. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into a demo. Let me put my little clicker down here. And there we go. All right, so let me bring all of my tabs over. Apologies for doing a split screen. This is what I get for doing this. All right, so we have over here, this is our Salesforce application. This is Provar Manager, which is being renamed to Provar Quality Hub, but that bit's not important for the meantime. What you need to know is this is where we do all of our reporting. So all of our reporting lives here. All of our integrations live here with things like DevOps Center, DevOps Testing, different DevOps tools that are on the Salesforce platform, which you all be familiar with. And this is where everything lives as far as, updating our test cases and seeing those results in live time. So we're looking at an Agentforce project here, and we're filtering by specific test plans. So we have a test plan called Salesforce Regression. and we're looking at some executions for the current week. We can see we have some failures. We can see we have some existing executions, and we also have a defect that just came in. So with this new defect that's just been raised, we can go and look at it. But essentially it is, we've ran an Agentforce test in Provar, we found a bug, we've raised it here, and so now we've been alerted to it. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. So let me go back over here. So I'll look at our defects here. This is the defect that has been raised. So I'm going to take a closer look at this defect that relates to Agentforce. So as I mentioned, this is where we do all of our integrations. So we can link this up to Jira, sync it back over to Jira. We can obviously relate this to any user stories or tasks that we've created there, any file attachments and different things. But we get the high-level view of this bug. This is something that has been manually set with a combination of what Provar provides automatically. So I put a little bit more context here, basically saying that the intent for our validation didn't properly pass because the agent didn't create a test plan schedule, so we need to refine our topic. We can look at this individual test execution to see exactly what happened and look at the results there. So it'll take you exactly to the point of failure. We'll see the detailed logs for the full test execution timeline and all of that good stuff. But I already know what the failure is because I intentionally put it there, of course. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over into Provar to show you what this looks like. All right, so this is Provar automation. So what you have here are the settings where we can create all of our different connections for establishing all of our systems that we're going to be testing. So we have Salesforce connections, we have web services, and all the different things that you would be wanting to test. But we also have connections to our agent that we're going to be testing. So I'll switch over to our tests here. And what we have is a specific test plan folder that's been created called Provar Agent with all of our test cases in it. And the way that we've grouped this can be, based on however your team operates. I've done it essentially by topic, so I have a specific test case for all of my topics for my agent. And then I'm covering a different multitude of scenarios using data sources that I'm reading in. So what that ends up looking like, you move over my data source here. So this is one of my data sources. Let me scroll here and make this a little bit bigger if I can. Okay, so this is what an Excel sheet looks like here. So I'm just basically, these are just different inputs for an agent to create a test plan schedule inside of Provar. We need a name, we need a system name, and all this information, right? We just kind of randomly generated 20 different iterations of what this might look like. So we're testing this across a range of different values, right? And what we have here is we're actually keeping an audit log where we're capturing the last agent, the last utterance, the last prompt that we sent to the agent. So we're logging that here so we know if there's a failure, we know which particular prompt caused that failure. And then we can also see the latest agent response. So we can see for all the ones that were successfully created and for any ones that weren't created, we'll see any results here from the agent response, and we have all that information. And then we're also just keeping track here locally of our test passes and our failures for individual rows. So we can go look at a specific row, like for example this one here. We can see that this one actually did not get created. The agent was asking for clarification. It says, can you assist me in creating this? The frequency wasn't right or something like that, right? So we need to go and refine probably just our test. This may not be an issue with the agent itself. So this is kind of where we're getting into the false positives scenarios there. But let me switch over back into Provar and show you an example of how we actually execute one of these test cases. So I'm going to launch it in test builder mode. So what you'll see happening are a number of different things. It's going to be loading in over here on your right, my left, where we're basically running through the test steps in live time. And we're also seeing some of the logging that's happening in the background. So this is connecting me to two different things. It's connecting me to my agent through API. And then we're going to be testing the agent directly through the API. And we're also connecting to Salesforce so we can validate any data that gets modified or created by the agent. So once that Salesforce connection step completes, we'll run through a couple of different iterations here to show you how we can generate different utterances using those input values from a spreadsheet. So let's open up my Salesforce browser on my other sheet here. So I'll just bring that one over here so you can see that load in. But we won't be really doing anything in the UI for this particular scenario. We're just going to be doing it mostly on the back end just to kind of show you how all this works. So I'll minimize that one for now. Salesforce is loaded over here on my other screen. So now it's generating some utterances. So what it's doing essentially is I set an initial prompt, and I'm using the utterance generator in Provar to randomize the prompt. I can basically set a set number for those utterances. So I'll show you how this was constructed. So this is that step here. So basically what I have is, this is my prompt, and I'm using a lot of variables here. This is where I'm pulling in from that data source. And I'm generating 3 different utterances for this particular scenario. And I'm going to be using these in a loop. So I'm basically just running through 3 different iterations of this test case generation agent action. So for test case generation, I specifically set in my agent instructions, do not validate or generate test cases on the single turn responses. So in other words, it's going to take a confirmation from the user. So I'll go ahead and run through it here. So it's establishing the connection to the agent, sending my initial request, and then we have the intent validation. So what the intent validation does is it takes the agent response and validates it based on what we expect it to be. We can pretty easily capture this if we go into Agentforce Builder, simulate a conversation there, and basically capture it back into Provar, and that becomes our test case. So we can see all this happening, and you won't see anything happening on the screen, but I'll show you actually what gets generated here. But what's happening now is I just confirmed with the agent that I want to generate the test cases. So it actually processed the AI test case generation. It validated the agent intent. And then we have a conditional here. So what you see quite often in Agentforce, when we're interacting with agents, is that it can take multiple different branches based on how users might interact with it. They might want to not confirm something. They may not want to save the test cases that get generated. So we have a branch here that handles that kind of logic natively. So I'm saying I did want to save my test, set that value in the test case, the spreadsheet rather, and then I end my agent conversation, and I'm also validating that the agent closes the conversation properly, so we have that last intent validation there as well. So to show you kind of a little bit of what this looks like, let me go back over here really quick in my Salesforce UI. So I'll go over to my agent builder, Agentforce Builder rather. Go to my agent that I have packaged on this particular org, and we're going to open it up in Builder. It's cut off here on the bottom. It's right down here. Okay, so basically what I did is I sent an initial prompt to the agent saying I want to create a test plan schedule with all this information, which we can easily simulate in Agentforce Builder. But again, the benefit in doing it in Provar is, like I said, we can generate those utterances, we can randomize it, but we can also validate the test cases that get generated once they get saved. So what happened is whenever I created those test cases and the agent validated, I log those test cases that get created, and I clean them up at the end of the test as well. So I'm not cluttering my org with any records that get generated. So we can say the same thing here. So let me go back over really quickly to my spreadsheet, which I have here, and I can copy in my main information here. Just going to copy all this and go back over into Agentforce, and it may or may not understand that unstructured data, but it looks like it did, so it was able to process all that. So basically, it set all that information, and it's saying, okay, here's the confirmation. Shall I proceed with generating? Yes. Generating, so it'll do the processing of actually generating the test cases based on the information that I provide. So you can kind of see how you could work these two in tandem. So we have 2 different things happening. We have the Agentforce Builder where we're testing it manually. We're making sure that it works for topic alignment, making sure that the topic selected here is correct, making sure the action that it's using is correct, making sure that all the data that it gets created is correct as well. So now it's asking me if I want to save. So yes, we'll save the test cases. The test cases will be saved in the org. And of course, we can verify those actual records in the org directly here as well. So we have all that information, right? So we're testing it in Provar, we're testing it with Testing Center, and we can test it in Agentforce Builder as well.